Welcome to Simply Christianity. In this week's video, we're going to start episode 2 of the series Arguments for God. As I said in the first video of the series, this series is a table of contents, so it's going to be very brief videos of the arguments, not getting into too much detail. Basically, they're just to show you what's out there, because I think a lot of people don't know the arguments that Christians use to show that their faith is rational, that it's reasonable. So I think that these videos are going to show you what's out there so that you can do research on your own. So for this video, we're going to talk about the Kalam Cosmological argument. And this argument has gotten a lot of press recently because it's the primary argument defended by Dr. William Lane Craig, who is probably the most popular academic apologist that I know of, at least in North America. He has a degree in theology and philosophy. He teaches at a university, and he does a lot of academic work, publishes in journals and the like. And quickly, a quick plug for reasonablefaith.org, his website. There are plenty of articles, both scholarly, for those of you who understand how to read the philosophical lingo, and popular for those of you who want the arguments but don't want that vocabulary that is so hard to understand sometimes. Also, some great podcasts and videos. My favorite part is the question and answer section. There are hundreds of question and answers on the website, and you can search them by subject. So if you have a question yourself that you think might have been asked already, you can search there, and it can be anything, whether it's about the Kalam Cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument I talked about in the first episode, the moral argument, any argument. It doesn't even have to be an argument. Some just Christian living, Christian issues. There's some probably answers to some questions there, and they're all well written. He's very smart and is very respectful. So with that plug, I'll put a link in the description below so that you can get to that quickly. Again, for this video, for this argument, that's where I'm going to send you to get more information. But also, that'd be a great resource just in general. So the Kalam Cosmological argument has two basic premises and one conclusion. The first premise is anything that begins to exist must have a cause. And this seems like a pretty uncontroversial premise at first. At first glance, everything I can think of that begins to exist, me, the apartment I'm in, the car, I can point to a cause, something that caused that thing to start existing. The car was manufactured in a plant. I was born from my mother. The apartment was built by construction workers. There are causes to these things that begin to exist. The second premise is the universe began to exist. And Dr. Craig uses primarily Big Bang cosmology to defend this. Big Bang cosmology points to what they call the singularity, where everything started. It's a single point where time, space, everything we know and love came from that point, which shows that the universe had a beginning. It didn't go on forever. It's not infinite in the past. It had a point where it started, for lack of a better term. It's hard because we're saying time started, and we don't have the vocabulary really to talk about that. But that's the basic idea there. Now, before we go into the most common objections, I do want to make something very clear that this argument relies on the assumption that an infinite regress is impossible. And this isn't necessarily just an assumption, like just some random assumption that has no backing. It has a lot of backing, lots of proofs that show an infinite regress is impossible. It just doesn't make logical sense. An infinite regress is where you have a causal chain, so cause and effect, that goes on infinitely into the past. And this just doesn't make any logical sense. I'm not going to go into much detail giving analogies and explaining how it all works, because people have done that online that I've seen, and they do it quite well. And again, I want to keep this video short. So just know that the argument does rely on that, and there are proofs and arguments out there for, I guess, not for, but rather against an infinite regress, both by Christians and theists and atheists alike. It's something that doesn't make a lot of sense. So with that out of the way, I want to go into some of the objections. So one of the objections is primarily with the second premise, that the universe began to exist. Many scientists have come up with ways to kind of get around the Big Bang cosmology, and in light of new quantum mechanics, this new field of science, if you will, some of the assumptions made with the Big Bang theory, the Big Bang model, don't quite work out. it is important to note out that we don't really know what quantum theories, what quantum models use, and so some of them contradict the Big Bang model, some of them don't. So we're kind of in a gray area. It doesn't necessarily disprove it, but now the proof isn't so well accepted in the scientific community. It's a question mark now. It used to not be a question mark. So what Dr. Craig falls back on is the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. I'll try and write it out in the description, so if you want to Google it on your own, you can. Basically what this theorem is it's a theorem that takes what our universe is, how it is, and basically proves that in order for our universe to be the way it is, it can't be infinitely in the past. It couldn't have existed infinitely into the past, regardless of what quantum theory, what quantum states end up being true or which ones are true. It's not a question mark. As far as I know, again, I'm not a scientist, so I could be incorrect, but again, I've read some of what Craig has written, some of what scientists have written on his behalf. He has scientists that kind of show how the things work out for him. So these things show, or at least appear to show, that the universe was not infinite in the past. At the very least, it's much more probable that it wasn't infinite into the past. Now, Vilenkin himself, one of the people in the theorists, said that it doesn't prove it doesn't prove a God. It doesn't prove that kind of a cause because it could be a different natural cause. But then that gets into the infinite regress, right? So you can't have an infinite causal chain back forever. And then that, again, is just plucking things out of thin air. As I said in the fine-tuning video, I believe, about the multiverse, it's the science of the gaps. It's just, oh, well, it could be this thing because it could be. So, God seems to make more sense. And so, again, the conclusion, this idea that there must have a cause, and that cause has to be God. And here's why. The cause can't be in time. It has to be an outside of time, which fits our description of God. God is outside of time. It has to be outside of the physical universe. It has to be outside of space, and God is outside of space. It also must have a will. If it's going to create something like the universe, if it's going to cause the universe, it must have a will to start it, to cause it to be, because God himself was not cause. He has no cause. He doesn't fall under the first premise. Premise does not say anything that exists has a cause. So many atheists will say, well, God has to have a cause, right? So what caused God? What caused God? And then they say that that's some big flaw with the Christian's argument. But this argument clearly shows it's everything that begins to exist has to have a cause. If God didn't begin to exist, then he doesn't have to have a cause. If he is in fact an eternal being, which is what Christians say he is. And so Christians believe that God is an eternal being. We believe this before we even developed this argument. And so when this argument came to light, when this argument came to be, God really fits this idea of this cause. Whatever this cause has to be, our God fits that criteria. One other objection real quick that I found very fascinating before I sign off here is the objection that we actually do witness things in the universe spontaneously come into existence. So physicists have created something called a quantum vacuum, which is something that has everything sucked out. There are no particles left. There's no light. There's no energy. Everything is sucked out. Just empty space. And then all of a sudden, the scientists will have their instruments, and their instruments will start reading particles popping into existence. And this seems to prove that things can be caused. It can come into existence without cause. It seems to disprove premise one. But it doesn't, and here's why. Space is a thing. Space isn't nothing. Space isn't what we philosophically talk about as nothing. When we say the universe came from nothing, we don't mean it came from empty space. Space was created. Space is something because we had nothing and now we have space. So space itself is something that's ripped full of energy and such, and this is, again, all on the Reasonable Faith website, which is taken from actual scientific resources. It's quite well known that space is something, and there's, you can also make the point that the fact that the instruments are there, they have to, they're influencing the system itself there as well. So basically, that was something I found when I first saw this argument. I thought that was kind of the nail in the coffin, like, oh, but we have these particles that pop into existence all the time. But that's not true because they pop into existence because of empty. The cause is empty space. It's quite fascinating. So just to briefly recap, we have premise one, everything that begins to exist has to have a cause. Premise two, the universe began to exist. 3, the conclusion, there must be a cause, and that cause is God, because God is the best explanation for this cause. Again, he's outside of time, we know that. He's outside of space, and he has a will. Those 3 things are pretty important for this cause, and God fits all those criteria quite nicely. So thanks for watching. Again, before I completely sign off, I do want to make this other point I made in the first video that, again, this doesn't prove a loving God. It doesn't prove Jesus by any means. It doesn't prove the Trinity, but it doesn't have to. Atheists will say all the time, well, that argument doesn't prove the Christian God, so it's worthless. And that's not true. All we have to do is show that there is some transcendent being, and then that will show that naturalism doesn't make sense. At the very least, what it does is it shows that believing in the supernatural is rational, is reasonable. And then what we can do as Christians and say, and then the most reasonable of those is Christianity, or the one that makes the most sense, or makes the most sense out of what we know about the supernatural being, what we can show. What makes the most sense out of life as we know it is Christianity. And that's where some of the arguments about Jesus Christ come into play, where the Bible comes into play, personal experience comes into play a lot there. So, again, just because it doesn't prove the Christian God point for point doesn't mean the argument is worthless. So thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful. I hope it went into just enough detail to kind of whet your palate. If not, please comment below. Let me know if you want me to go into more detail in these videos or not. If you want less detail, what arguments you want to see next if you know of some. If you're new here, please subscribe. That way you can be up to date, not just on these videos, but on other ones. I plan on doing some other videos outside of this area about just basic Christian living, basic Christian principles. So yeah, subscribe if you want to keep those updates. If you did like the video, please like it. If you didn't, please dislike it. It helps to show me what people respond to best. If it's these type of videos or a different type of video, that's how I learn. So please like, dislike, comment below any questions, comments, or concerns you may have. So thanks for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.